Warning, this episode contains content that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Some events go to show that tragedy can come at just about any time, at any place. A man with a deep, seething hatred for society, a family life that could be considered anything but normal, and a violent resolution that will never be forgotten. All this and more as we explore the anatomy of murder. It was July 18th, 1984. James Huberty, a 41-year-old man from San Diego, approached a McDonald's in San Isidro. Step by step over the hot pavement of the parking lot, he walked closer and closer to forever change the lives of those inside and anyone who knew them. He came prepared to teach society a lesson, one that would ripple painfully through time forever. In his hands, he carried a Winchester 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Other than that, he adorned two more guns, one 9mm Browning HP semi-automatic and a 9mm Uzi carbine. Over his shoulder was a cloth bag sagging from the considerable weight of hundreds of rounds of ammunition for each weapon he possessed that day. Inside the McDonald's, 45 customers went about with their meals, the restaurant full of chatter, laughter, and the mechanical chorus from the cash registers as customers placed their orders, unaware that chaos was on its way through the door. James pushed through the glass threshold, the bells above his head sounding off as one final, hopeless warning to all those inside. James Huberty, a man who suffered at the hands of his own mind. 2 days before James stepped foot into that McDonald's, he had been waiting by the phone for hours, faithfully anticipating the familiar ring. He was calm and quiet on the outside, but his mind swirled with chaos and desperation. A couple of days prior, James had spoken with his wife, Etna, telling her that he believed he may have had a serious mental problem and that he was sure he needed help. That was why James was sitting by the phone that day. A few hours before, he had called a mental health clinic and requested an appointment. He spoke with the receptionist and was incredibly polite and level-headed. He simply knew that he had to speak to someone professionally. Hopefully, they could help him. The receptionist told James that someone would call him back soon, a little later that very day, in fact, but the call didn't come. James was left waiting by the phone, unmoving, for several hours, entirely unaware that not only did the receptionist misspell his name, but she also, due to James's politeness and calm demeanor, marked his situation as a non-crisis, which were typically handled within a 48-hour window of time, not same day, like she had told James it would be. James eventually couldn't wait any longer, so he stood up from the phone and walked out the door without saying a word. Etna heard his motorcycle fire up and drive off, its loud rumble trailing off into the distance. Where James went that day, no one knows, but Etna recalled that James returned home in a much better mood, far more content than he had been since he voiced his concern to her over his mental state. He sat and had a pleasant meal with his wife and their two daughters, aged 12 and 10, before going on a short family bicycle ride to the park. After returning home and putting the girls to bed, James and Etna sat down in the living room together and watched a movie. By the looks of it, James and Etna were a good couple with a loving family. Where it all went wrong may have been considered a mystery, but the truth of the matter was much darker than that. James was hardly a model father or even what could be considered a good man. James had a past that built a rather worrying profile. James was born on October 11, 1942 in Ohio, where he spent a good portion of his life. When he was only a child, he was often cast out by the other children, who would whisper amongst themselves about how James came from a broken home, a bad home, which was a foreign concept to the Amish and Mennonite children who occupied the majority of his school. James's parents had separated when he was only 7 years old, and James took it incredibly hard. Being surrounded by children who not only failed to understand but muttered about him behind his back made the situation all the more difficult. James was largely alienated and a loner who had no interest in the things other kids his age did, like sports. In fact, in 7th grade, he was the only boy in his class that didn't play on the school's football team, but he sure had an affinity for guns, even before the 8th grade. Fellow students recalled James having a rather short temper as well. While it didn't get him into trouble, he was quick to become furious if someone upset him. One particular moment that made him angry and upset happened when he was sitting alone in the classroom while his classmates all played football outside, something he did quite often. Getting into a minor altercation with his teacher rudely sneered at him, saying, "If you were a real man like all the other boys, you'd be out playing football." Throughout his later years in high school, things weren't that much different. James enjoyed quiet activities that required intellect rather than physical activities. In fact, he participated in so few things that he didn't even show up to have his photo taken for the yearbook when he graduated in 1960, so no photo was entered into the book. Around 20 years of age and free from the discomforts of school, James spent much of his time with Etna, who he married a short time later, before the two eventually moved in together and lived with James's father. But despite the fact that James didn't care much for school, he did have a passion that he knew he'd need to get an education to pursue. He wanted to be a funeral director, so he became a student of Malone College in Canton, Ohio, received a diploma from Pittsburgh Mortuary School, and got his first job as an apprentice embalmer, but never fulfilled his goal of becoming a funeral director because he failed to pay $15 in fees for his funeral director and embalmer's license. But one man named Don Williams, who James had done embalming for in the past, believed that James was never fit to be a funeral director at all. He would actively avoid working with others and preferred to be alone with the bodies in the embalming room, not out front working with families as a funeral director has to. So it's quite possible that James sabotaged his own goals due to his incessant need to be a loner. Just about anyone who knew James knew that there was something not quite right about him. A pastor that knew James from the church services he attended with Etna and her family described him as bitter against God, a man who had pent-up emotions but would sometimes have explosive displays of personality. Just talking to him made it abundantly clear that James was full of inner conflicts that were wound up tightly. Any job he held, his co-workers described him much the same, saying he was afraid, angry, and a bit paranoid a lot of the time. One of his old bosses noted that James was very displeased with the United States and often thought about leaving it behind. He was known to hold grudges and never let up on anyone who angered him until it was made right in James's eyes. One of his neighbors recalled his home life, often hearing him screaming in rage. He kept a large gun collection in his home and posted numerous no trespassing and beware of dog signs all around his property in a clear display of overkill to keep people away from him. James hated his neighbors, as they often complained about his German shepherds for an assortment of reasons, such as constant barking and destruction of property. Anytime a neighbor complained, it further infuriated James. And then James and Etna had children. Their two daughters would often talk about witchcraft and Satan worship. They'd conduct seances together and brag to just about anyone about them, even their babysitter, claiming that spirits had told them vital information about family events, such as when they would finally move away from Ohio. Eventually, James's two daughters and two daughters of a neighboring family got into a fight. James didn't like this, not one bit. He told the parents of the two girls that he'd get even for the altercation. It was about 2 weeks later when he did something very much out of character. He invited some of the neighborhood kids over for Cracker Jacks. The children came, one of which was one of the girls from the fight. James noticed her approach and excused himself to step inside his house. The door flew open and out came his daughter, Bobby, who marched right up to the girl and punched her hard in the eye, a clear setup so that James's daughter could get even. The girl's father, needless to say, was rather upset and questioned James as to why he would have set up that fight. James told the man he always paid his debts, good or bad, and that it was only a matter of time before he got even with the rest of the kids. Over 2 whole months later, James was still fuming for revenge, and so he sent his daughter Bobby to hide in some bushes by the road while he watched. Bobby waited there as the neighbor's daughter walked down the sidewalk. Once close enough, Bobby pounced from the bushes and struck the girl. Etna wasn't a positive influence on her children either. Etna once told their other daughter, Zelia, to physically assault one of her classmates, which sparked a dispute between herself and the child's mother, which led to Etna threatening to shoot the woman dead with a 9mm pistol. Police were called, Etna was arrested, but police didn't confiscate the weapon. On top of being a loner and having a family that resorted to violent resolutions, James found it very difficult to maintain employment. There was another common sign of a potential mass murderer in the making: constant and repeated failure and a lack of ability to fit in. While these things alone don't mark a killer, another alarming sign came to light from a former co-worker of James's. When James had money problems, he started to blame the government. It was no secret that he didn't enjoy the United States, but this was different. This was more unstable. He believed that President Ronald Reagan himself was conspiring against him, and even went so far as to write a letter to apply for residency in Mexico. And in January of 1984, feeling that Ohio no longer had anything left to offer him, he and his family moved to Tijuana, Mexico, but only remained there for a short time before they returned to the United States, this time settling in San Isidro, a community of San Diego, California. James applied for a new job once there as a security guard. The first company turned him down outright due to an obvious attitude problem, but James got a job as a security guard with a different company shortly after. But unsurprisingly, that job didn't work out either, and he was fired. Some sources claim that after this most recent failure, James attempted to kill himself, but Etna stopped him, something Etna would later claim she regrets doing. This was around the time that James had finally figured out that there may have been something wrong with his brain. But after the clinic failed to call him back, James just took that as the one final blow. He wouldn't allow himself to be screwed over again. He even confided in Etna, telling her that society had their chance and that he now had to take matters into his own hands. Before leaving for McDonald's that fateful day, he told his daughters and wife goodbye, giving his wife a kiss before he went to leave, something she found unusual as he wasn't normally affectionate like that. She asked where he was going. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her a little. "Hunting humans," he said, and that was it. Very soon after, James pushed his way into the McDonald's in San Isidro and aimed his shotgun at one of the workers there, a 16-year-old boy. He pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. Shockingly, the worker thought it was simply a very bad joke someone was playing on him. James checked his gun and successfully fired it into the ceiling. At that moment, stunned and deafened by the blast, the restaurant erupted into panic. James withdrew his Uzi and shot 2 workers and demanded everyone to get on the ground, claiming that he had killed many and would be killing many more. One man named Victor Rivera, who was only 25 years old at the time, attempted to calm James down and keep him from shooting anyone else, but no one could tell James what to do anymore. This was about revenge against the society that had abandoned and conspired against him. These people had to pay so that his voice could truly be taken seriously. So he shot Victor Rivera 14 times while he screamed helplessly from the floor. Little did anyone know the nightmare was only beginning. As customers sobbed uncontrollably and did their best to hide, James came upon a group of women and children all grouped together, pleading for their lives. He filled them with rounds from his Uzi and shotgun, killing most of them right there, one pregnant woman being shot 48 times with the Uzi. The woman had another child, a son who was only 8 months old, beside her. The baby cried loudly, and without a shred of compassion or mercy in his heart, James took his 9mm pistol and shot the infant in the center of the back, killing him instantly. He continued firing at people, looking to kill as many as he could, specifically those being shielded by their families and loved ones. 3 11-year-old boys, having no idea what was going on inside, rode their bikes to McDonald's to get some drinks. James opened fire on the boys from inside, striking all 3 of them. Of the 3 boys, 2 died: David Delgado and Omar Hernandez. An elderly couple named Miguel and Ada approached the McDonald's as well. Miguel opened the door for his wife, who was met by James aiming a shotgun at her head. He pulled the trigger and struck Ada in the head, killing her. Miguel collapsed and cradled his wife's body, wiping blood from her face, cursing James. James walked up to Miguel and executed him with a single shot to the head. Police by this time had been contacted numerous times, however, dispatchers sent them to the wrong McDonald's. Police eventually did arrive at the correct location and set up a command post, but didn't know how many shooters were inside due to the fact that James was using different guns. A SWAT sniper took a position on top of a post office building that had been next door and searched for James and for a clear shot to take him out while he continued on his rampage. The massacre lasted 78 minutes and James had fired off a minimum of 245 rounds of ammunition. After that point, the SWAT sniper got a clear shot and sent a round right through James's aorta and out the back of his spine, sending him to the floor in a bloody, heaving mess. The sniper watched his final movements before he died right there in front of the service counter among all the dead that he had killed. Once police entered the building, they discovered the horror, the truth that James had killed 21 people and seriously wounded 19 others. Only one of the people shot lived long enough to make it to the hospital, where they died shortly after. The total victims, whether wounded or killed that day, ranged from 4 months old to 74 years old. Local funeral homes had to resort to using a nearby civic center in order to hold all of the wakes for all of the dead. And within only 2 days of the shooting, the McDonald's was renovated and refurbished, with some employees hoping that it would return to the way things were and not forever be marked by the terror that occurred there. But that wouldn't be the case. It was eventually decided that the McDonald's would be torn down and a monument would be erected to remember those who had been victimized that day by the merciless killer, James Huberty. That's all for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel now, because you won't want to miss what's next. Also, be sure to check out my video on the senseless murder of Daniel Paulin, caught on camera. You can either press on screen now or below this video, and I will see you next Sunday.